Hello and welcome everybody, and welcome back to At the Table. In this episode, we're going to talk about something that is really important and up in time. We're going to talk about negotiation, supply chain, and what has that got to do with security policy. So in this episode, I am very honored and pleased to have an expert on board that will talk about the world of supply chain and the challenges that we're facing right now and probably even more so tomorrow. And what we're going to talk about especially is the China-Western climate in the world of negotiation, together with whatever we have in the new world of Mexico. Welcome, Andrew. I am so delighted and happy that you took out some time to spend a little bit of your precious time with me here today. The reason I invited Andrew is I have been following his work for a long time. Andrew is truly an expert in Asian, Latin American matters when we talk about culture and negotiation. So, Andrew, thank you so much for taking time out doing this with me. Could you put a few words on yourself, Andrew? What's your background?
Hi, Keld. It's great to be here. I'm also a longtime fan and follower of yours, so this is pretty special for me. I'll tell my story backwards. I'm right now in Mexico. I am working with people to help U.S. and European multinationals adjust their supply chains. And when I say adjust their supply chains, I mean to adjust them vis-a-vis China. And that brings up my long-term history. I spent 10 years living in China from 2002 to 2012. And then I spent a lot of time in Thailand and Vietnam. Previous to China, I lived in Taipei, I lived in Japan. So just by dint of being there for 20 plus years, I guess I became an expert on Asian or Chinese negotiation, specifically, but Asian negotiation techniques in general.
That's outstanding, Andrew. Yeah, no, it's lovely to have an expert on board who is not a theoretical expert, but it's actually been there and done it and felt it on their own body.
You've got to go there and do it. I don't want to say this because I have a very expensive education behind me, but I probably learned more about negotiating in Asia by going to the local markets and just dealing with regular people. And you have to be there for that. You have to sort of be on your own. And that's what I'm going through in Mexico right now. I just kind of flung myself into deep into Mexico, and I'm figuring out what local people, what traditional culture, what culturally traditionally Latin American and Mexican negotiators think and feel. And that's my approach to negotiation. I do cross-cultural negotiation, and my mission in life is to figure out their attitudes, their values, and what they think is a legitimate, fair outcome.
Right. Andrew, if you are sitting in procurement, supply chain, legal, right now and watching this, why is the whole world of supply chain? I mean, there's already issues enough and problems enough within supply chain. Why is it of interest right now to keep listening and watching us talking about the situation with China, the potential interest of moving production out of China into somewhere else? Why is this important right now?
China and the China business for procurement people. I'm not going to make any political statement about China or Chinese leadership. But for us, those of us that were in business in China, we're a victim of our own success. China became too successful. They sucked in all the supply chains, all of each supply chain and all of the supply chains, to the point where if you were factoring anything that involved more than 2 or 3 components, or you were buying anything that was partially made, a partially completed good, you were involving yourself in China, whether you knew it or not, whether you wanted to or not. And China, the China supply chain is part of an overall government party plan within China. So it
Right.
had a security element, even though you didn't. Even though you, as a
Mm.
procurement person, wanted to stay as far from politics as possible, as you always do, that wasn't happening in China. So
Right.
what happened was, at the same time, the the international chambers of commerce were giving their thumbs up to doing more and more in China.
Mm.
Security governments and security people and unions and non-Chinese competitors were saying, "Hold on, we have a big problem here."
Mm.
And it
Mm.
came to a head in, in the 20, when was Obama? This came to a head at the end of the Obama administration, and the United States thought they were going to respond with the comprehensive trade agreement, the CPT, the Comprehensive and Progressive Treaty on Trade. When the Trump administration came in 2016, they had a different approach. They just got rid of the treaty, and
Mm.
instead they went with tariffs and with restrictions.
Mm.
The
Right.
new administration in the United States, the Biden administration, is continuing that trend, but they are layering on Cold War and security type responses. So we have a lot
Mm.
of military talk in the region, and we have a lot of security and military tension.
Mm.
And
Right.
ordinarily, this should not be affecting our lives as non-political actors, but it is. The boats
Mm.
aren't. The boats. We don't know when the boats are going to arrive.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Later on,
Andrew.
you
Yeah.
also,
Sure.
another problem, of course, is the COVID response in China, which is still
Mm.
shutting down big big commercial sectors, and shutting down ports. So we
Right.
don't know
Right.
when the boats are coming in.
Right. Andrew, in our preparation talk, you said something very interesting because obviously you spend a lot of time in Asia and specifically in China, but you're not there anymore. You're in Mexico now, and
Yeah.
the reason for that is.
The reason for that, Keld, is I'm taking my own advice.
Mm.
I'm taking my own advice, and I'm diversifying my commercial to learn, on the ground, to learn the culture and to learn the business and to learn to read the business news in Spanish, because it's
Mm.
completely different. But that's me. I'm the early guy. But I'm telling you this, Cloud, and I'm telling you this to all the people watching you. Now is the
Mm.
time to start investigating and exploring the Mexico option if you haven't done that already. It
Right.
just
Right.
is going to be completely different, and this is what people are finding. Operating in Mexico is completely different from operating in China.
Mm.
Even though you're going to end up with the same product, and you're going to end up with the
Mm.
same result in
Mm.
terms of the physical product and in terms of the business relationship. We all
Mm.
want a cordial, professional business relationship that yields a string of profitable transactions. That's what we
Mm.
want.
Mm.
But to get there in Mexico and Latin America is completely different from the
Mm.
means we used in China. And someone has to go and learn this first, and that's, I guess, me.
Mm.
But now the procurement people have to step up and to start to at least develop a information plan, at least
Mm.
develop a strategy for how to
Mm.
negotiate about the negotiation, which I
Right.
know is you like doing. And
Mm.
now we have to. Now it's time for the
Right.
procurement people to start at least negotiating about the negotiation.
Right. Andrew, I've been thinking about something, and I think on day one when you're studying supply chain, the professor will tell you that you should never be dependent on just one supplier. You always need an alternative as well.
Yep.
So getting back to that, how come so many Western companies, both in North America and Europe, put all their eggs in one nest and just relied on a Chinese manufacturer? Why is that?
All right. Okay. Most of it all comes down to money and to savings.
Mm.
And um, at some point in the 1980s, the mainstream United States business, Main Street, Wall Street, and management all decided that China was thumbs up. All the big
Mm.
management consulting companies, Bain and McKinsey, started selling China as a product.
Right.
So up until now, people had been dipping their toe. Up until the late 80s, the mid 90s and the late 90s, people have been dipping their toe into the waters of China production. But two things began to happen. Three things. One, this became Chinese policy. Chinese industrial policy became filling these coastal factories, even if it was at a loss, so that the Chinese could understand business and uplift the masses.
Right.
This was parties when Deng Xiaoping was still around. I'm old, so I'm going back in time. But this is how the scene was set. So you had all these empty, especially economic zones along the coast.
Right.
And China really wanted to fill them. McKinsey really wanted to sell its outsourcing product. Wall Street really wanted to open this new territory. So all the lights were green on just first dipping a toe into China, but then Chinese developed, or the Western media developed this concept about China, the race to the bottom. Anything anyone else could do, China could do it cheaper, they could do it faster, and they could do it with more, with fewer hassles. Because the government was on board. You need water, the government will get you water. You need electricity, no problem. You need registration, we'll take care of that. That's when the Shenzhenification of the supply chain took place. So you went to China and you were making this thing, this simple little widget, and you needed this piece attached to this piece. Well, your China guy, your factory manager in China had a connection. He knew a guy. And that's what in China. Everyone knew a guy. So your supply chain got deeper and deeper into China, number one. And number two, it became less formalized because when the engineer left Detroit, he had a blueprint and a bill of materials, and he had specific plans. 6 months later, when he left China, he had this widget, and he didn't know how it was made. So it just became more and more, the suction of China just became more and more because you were having good stuff made cheaply, on time, and you weren't paying for the engineering. Someone else was doing it. Your factory manager was coming back with a prototype, and he was coming back with a guy's name and a price, and it was a great price. So all the business went into something that was planned high level, some of it was planned at the low level, but and the West went along with it because the profits were good, the stock prices were high, and we thought we'd never have to pay the piper. When I lived in China, I was interviewed by very, very knowledgeable journalists based in China, and this is going back to the the 2000s, and the question I said was, well, when do you think that China, when China falls, when China, when gravity happens in China, this is what's going to be the response? And he looked at me like he didn't understand what I was saying. He said, why is China going to fall? I said, everything falls. But no, that was, the editors wouldn't listen. No one would buy that. But here we are now, where we don't know when the boats are coming in. And if it's a chain, that's a problem. You don't know what you sell into the China supply chain, and you don't know what you can take out of the China supply chain. So your risk as a procurement person just went from here to off the screen.
Yeah, because I think, Andrew, I know nothing about it more than what I'm reading in the media, but it seems that if you are procuring stuff in China, especially within technology right now, there might even be that the laws are catching up to you and preventing you from buying certain stuff in China. Isn't that the case?
The problem with adverse regulation is understated and very dangerous. We don't. There are all these new laws coming out in the United States about what you can do and what you can't do, and anything that involves customs, anything that involves CFIUS, CFIUS, it's a congressional oversight of transactions taking place of foreigners in the United States. Anything having to do with supply chain, anything having to do with security, the laws are vague. They are changing all the time, and it depends on someone's interpretation of them.
right.
So
So
the transaction that was absolutely fine in 2012 might get you into a lot of trouble in 2022.
right. Yeah, the latest thing that I read about, Andrew, I think we discussed it in our preparation call, was that what was it? They had grounded the F-35 because they found there was a magnet that was produced in China. Was that the case?
This is the nightmare. This is the
Yeah.
nightmare. Yeah, somewhere deep in your supply chain, they used a material or they used a technique. Someone in your supply chain used a material or technique from China.
Mm.
Now it's showing up deep in your supply chain and you didn't even know it was there.
Right.
Yeah, this
Right.
is the nightmare. And now in military, they're going to be more sensitive to this. But the
Sure.
fact is, Kel, we don't know how they're going to interpret these laws.
Right.
We don't know how they're interpreting them now, and we don't know how they're going to interpret them in a year. And this is a big source of problems, not only for the China supply chain, but I dare say for other supply, for the Vietnamese supply chain and the Thai supply. There is going to be this problem of just slapping Vietnamese or other labels on Chinese made goods.
Right. Andrew, a very difficult question, Andrew. If you were sitting as head of procurement in a major corporation, either in North America or Europe, and you have majority of your suppliers based in China right now, what would you do right now if you haven't started doing it already?
I would investigate alternatives. China Plus One, for me, China Plus One was the American. I don't know if industry is using it, but everyone wanted the industry to use it. China Plus One was the idea of growing outside of China, but maintaining what you had in China. Right. That's becoming less viable, number one. But number two, the Plus One, I really think should be outside of Asia.
Right.
I think you've got to, especially if you're marketing to North America, to the United States, you've got to look at that 2,000-mile land border as an asset, a potential asset for your company.
Right.
Now,
Yep, sorry, go ahead.
The 2,000-mile border is going to be a very valuable asset if you make it that. But there's a lot of work between here and there. So if I were head of procurement, the first thing I'd be looking for is who has my specialties? Where else can I go? Because you'll find that if you're doing autos in Mexico, you go to this part of Mexico. If you're doing electronics, there are better supply chains in other parts of Mexico. This is the kind of thing where it's going to take you 6 months to get the feel of it. So start now.
Right. Would it be possible, just to take a theoretical example, would it be possible for Apple to take their production out of Asia or China and move that to Mexico?
Yes, but they could move the assembly into Mexico, definitely. They could find the workers, they could find the resources. They could definitely move, they could definitely do final production in Mexico or Latin America.
Right.
It will take time for them. They could develop the workforce and they could develop the supply chains. A lot of the stuff they're putting into the iPhone is going to be coming through China. Okay. A lot of the components right now, that's where the fight is. A lot of the components, there's a problem. We can only get the components from the United States, but you can only process the components in China.
Right.
We're working this out.
Right.
There are gaps in the Mexico skill level. So you're not Apple is not leaving Asia behind completely.
Right.
Or if they are, they're something it. Foxconn is probably working on that. Desperately. They have moved stuff into India. They are moving stuff into Vietnam. So it is possible, but it's not going to be quick or clean.
Right. So Andrew, what industries right now would be a no-brainer? What industry could easily swap from, let's say, China into Mexico?
Auto. The automobile industry has deep roots in Mexico, and it's top of the line production. It's American production, American style production. But the supply chains are already well established. They are growing, and if you're working into that supply chain, if you're part of the auto supply chain, Mexico is a no.
Right.
EVs, the subset of electric vehicles, both automobiles and industrial and other, they're
Right.
making a big push for that in Mexico, and this is a good time.
Right.
Aerospace.
Right.
Aerospace is another big industry for Mexico, and assembly. Anything that is labor intensive, that
Right.
takes a lot of hands on a product that is eventually going into the United States, that's pretty much a no-brainer as well. Mexico is particularly well set up to export into the United States because of USCMA, the United States, Canada, Mexico agreement, known in Mexico as TMEC, known to many of your viewers as NAFTA 2. NAFTA 2 is a powerful draw for people who are importing into the United States, exporting from the country into the U.S.
Right. Okay. Now, Andrew, what are the key things when you start moving your negotiation with a Chinese sub-supplier into a Mexican sub-supplier? What are the key things that you should be aware
of? First, you want to understand that the attitude towards supply chain is very different. In Mexico, it is an extension of the U.S. supply chain. They consider Mexican negotiators consider themselves to be part of the North American economy, especially on the border. That 2,000-mile border I was telling you about has something called the maquila or maquiladora factories. These are factories that have a special deal with the United States, with the customs people. You can import raw materials into Mexico with getting a VAT refund. So you're not paying VAT taxes. When you import into Mexico, you factor, you produce, you transform in these factories in the United States, and then depending on the details, you can import into or export into the United States tariff-free. So it is. Sometimes if you want to do a search on this at home, search maquiladora and search IMEX, IMMEX. These are shelter. You also see shelter programs. These are tax advantaged programs, basically designed by the auto industry in the United States, so that they could produce in Mexico using Mexican labor, but U.S. technology and global inputs. So you can work out a way of getting into this program. If you were selling into the United States, that's the first thing you want to determine. Second thing you want to determine is where you should be in Mexico, who your partners should be, and how to establish a shelter program. Shelter program is equivalent to a Chinese SEZ. The shelter program is the closest thing you're going to find left in the world to a special economic zone. And this is just that the way to access that tax advantaged factoring system using a local partner right away. This will take you a matter of months. And once you've done that, you are expected to build your own supply chain in Mexico. In China, the factory manager will take care of that, or someone will take care of that. In Mexico, that's you. You're the guy who takes care of that. There are people who will help, but what you will find is that the procurement chain in Mexico is much more DIY. It's much more do-it-yourself. The service supply chain that you had at your disposal in China, you had the local bilingual expert on taxes, the local bilingual expert on procurement, the local metals guy, the local the local shipping guy. In Mexico, you are expected to bring all of that to the table. There isn't like the Shanghai long bar kind of hangout for expats. There isn't an expat community in Mexico, and if there is, it's mostly Latin American. Your guys, the guys from Caterpillar, the guys from Ford, are managing that supply chain from Detroit or from the Illinois headquarters. There is no separate supply chain for Mexico. It's
Right.
the North American supply chain. And yours, if you're
Right.
bringing something in from China, you have to work that out.
Right. Right. Okay. Um, Again, we're generalizing, Andrew, but if you move production from China to Mexico, and again, as I said, I emphasize I'm generalizing, but what is that cost difference? I mean, if you say cost in China is 100, how much would cost of production be in Mexico? And again, I understand it varies from industry to industry, but just
It
generalization.
varies. The generalization is now the cost differential is roughly flat or slightly favoring Mexico with tariffs and with restrictions in place.
Okay.
So the tariffs were, they I hope they had a beneficial effect in the United States because we're paying for it in terms of inflation. But I know they had a beneficial effect in Mexico. They really were a shot in the arm for Mexican factoring, for Mexican supply chain. So with tariffs, Mexican production is the same. I think Mexican labor is cheaper, but other things in Mexico like electricity and water are more.
Right. Right.
But the logistics issues, the bottlenecks and the shipping delays are throwing a wrench into the supply chain calculations in China.
Right.
In Mexico, this favors Mexico. Mexico may it's land based. It's all so it's a much more attractive, much more predictable flow expense in Mexico. So that's going to favor. It's becoming a lower risk proposition to manufacture in Mexico.
I also guess, Andrew, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I also guess that one thing that we learned during COVID as well was that keeping production closer to ourselves seems to be a good thing, right?
Yeah, it's just China and Vietnam, where I was during COVID, became very unpredictable. It became very unpredictable for American businesses, and American businessmen were screaming into their phones, but you promised, but you said. And the Chinese and the Vietnamese factory managers are saying, dude, I'm at home. I'm locked in my house with my children. I want to be at the factory. I am not at the factory. I am not at the port. And that became just this X factor. Americans were facing it too, to a degree, but not like in China. Vietnam. Vietnam was literally shut down. I mean, that's where I was, so I know firsthand that people in the United States, it was very severe. They shut down the airport. You couldn't move stuff in or out of Vietnam for many months, and that's where I was there. So it became very unpredictable, and you couldn't even get people on the phone. They had nothing to say. So keeping it close to them. At least, they don't shut down highways. They try. If worst comes to worst, in an emergency, a last-ditch emergency situation, you knew you could drive to your factory.
Right.
That wasn't happening since then.
Now, another question I want to ask you, Andrew, is in these times of technology, where we have more and more technology and equipment during production, and perhaps not as labor intensive as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now we're talking about, low cost production countries, China, Mexico, Thailand, Vietnam, what have you. But I've been talking to companies who are actually pulling back, moving production back to either United States or Europe, because they say, well, it's the machinery that is doing the production, and having two people employed, whether they're sitting in China or they're sitting in the US, doesn't really matter. So why not keep production in Chicago instead of China? Is that a thing as well, Andrew?
I think it's going to be a thing. I think we're 10 years or 15 years off from that. I think it's going to be a financial thing, because it's still a lot cheaper to hire a Mexican team to assemble your part than to build a Tesla style mega factory. For some things, the Tesla style mega factory is going to make sense, and I think a lot of people should be losing sleep over this. That is coming. We're not there. That's not going to be that will eventually be cheaper per unit, but the setup costs are going to be enormous. And a lot of Western companies are going the opposite direction. They are
Right.
still saying, well, we're saving a penny keeping production in China, even though the
Right.
risk is going off the chart. So let's do that. Let's save
Right.
10 cents.
Right.
These Tesla-style mega factories are the future, but that's what they are.
Mm.
They're the future. They're
Right.
not today.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So just moving back to the whole world of negotiation, leaving Asia or China specifically and moving into Mexico or Latin America, what's the key thing? What's the bullet point, Andrew, that you could pass on as an important advice? What is it that the negotiator should be aware of meeting the Mexican counterpart?
Okay. Let's focus on China versus Mexico because that's what I know and that's what people are interested in. Not to diss the other cultures, but Chinese negotiators are known as patient pragmatists. They will wait forever and they will make whatever adjustments need to be made. But if the relationship isn't yielding results, they will move on. In Mexico, they are decisive and they are traditional. If the answer is no in Mexico, you're going to hear a no. Chinese negotiators don't like saying no. It sounds bad in Chinese. It sounds rude and a little abrupt. And also, the Chinese attitude is, if I can keep this relationship going at low or no cost, I'm going to do that. And if that means telling Keld, oh, it'll be ready next week, it'll be ready next month, it's difficult, but in the future, things might change. That's what I'll tell him.
Sure.
Because he might be useful for something else someday down the line. And who knows, the situation may really change. Happen. They say, Keld, I love you, but no, absolutely not. We're not doing this. And the reason may be because we haven't done this before.
Right.
This isn't the usual way of doing it. Because I don't see how every step in the process is going to work. In China, engineers are famous for coming up with creative, innovative workarounds. We'll make this happen somehow. We don't know how. It may not be pretty. They may be wedging pieces of wood under a delicate machine to get it to level out. Don't ask, but it'll work. That is not the way in Mexico, where their supply chain and their sort of all their chain of command is from Detroit or is from it's heavy engineering, U.S. engineer or German engineering focus. So they're not do their clever little workarounds to fix something. They're going to do it the right way. And that's what you have to understand about Mexico. They are going to give you a definite answer, whether you want to hear that answer or not, whether you're getting a definite answer or not. In China, they are very reluctant to say no. In Mexico, they are not reluctant to say no. Mexico is more tried and true. They like to see how it's going to end up before they go forward. And Mexicans are much more transparent than in China. In China, you might not know who the real decision makers are. In Mexico, you know who the decision makers are. You'll know straight up. And you'll know what their interests are. And their interests are in having all the pieces of the puzzle line up, in place before they take the next step. China had this saying about crossing the river by feeling for the stones. They don't do that in Mexico. They want to see the path before they start crossing that river.
Right. So based on what you said right there, Andrew, it sounds like, just based on that a relationship with a Mexican counterpart should somehow be easier than a Chinese counterpart. Is that your experience?
It's easier to start the relationship, but even with a relationship in place, a Mexican will say no. That's not the way to do it. In China, sometimes those relationships help you, but in China, the relationships are two-way. When you have guanxi in Mexico, when you have guanxi in China, it's as much an obligation as it is an opportunity. In Mexico, it's much more American-style relationships. Honor and pride and respect play a bigger role on the Mexican side of the border than on the American side of the border. But it's going to be much more. We'll do the transactions. Will empower the relationship. In China, the relationship empowers or enables the transaction. It's kind of You do show up, you do what you say you're going to do, you honor your promises once, twice, three times. Okay, now we can talk
Right.
about your ideas. Now
Sure.
we can talk about the changes you want to make.
Right.
In
Right.
China, you'd establish the relationship first.
Right. Right. One important thing, especially when we talk legal and contract management, my experience with Chinese is that the contract is not necessarily the end of any negotiation process. The contract may not necessarily be the end of anything, and the contract is renegotiable all the time. Would you agree with that? And how do you see that in comparison to a Mexican contract? Is that considered the same important document as it would be in the US?
Okay, I had a check my neck because I was nodding so much while you're saying it. Yes, in China, the negotiation is the starting point. It's the starting point of the negotiation. The real negotiation happens after. And if you're in procurement, and I'm sure that a lot of you have learned this, if you want, schedules kept or some sort of long-term relationship or long-term transaction established, that is an extra negotiation at the beginning. Don't assume the contract is going to bind that. In Mexico, it's sort of the opposite. In Mexico, the contract you sign is going to, especially if you're in the auto supply chain. And that's what I'm really talking about. I go back and forth between here and Saltillo and Monterrey in Mexico. Those are, they call Saltillo the Detroit of Mexico. So speak to that. That's what I'm speaking to. This is, Caterpillar. This is real middle America values in Mexico. So that's how they feel about a contract. Your word is your bond, and if it's not, this contract certainly is.
Yeah, right.
To the point where the auto industry, Detroit, is assessing fines and assessing penalties on subcontractors who can't maintain quality levels, just as they do in the United States and in other places. But that's what's governing Mexico negotiating behavior.
Right.
With the caveat, Keld, that the government here is kind of a wild card. The government here has nationalized industries. They're not going to nationalize the auto industry, we hope, knocking wood, but they have they played at nationalizing the lithium industry, which goes directly to the electric vehicle industry.
Right.
So in general, when a Mexican negotiates with you, it is with the same import and the same immediacy as an American negotiator, plus you get those high Mexican values for uncertainty avoidance. They don't like uncertainty. So they are going to really put more into it's American negotiating style plus. Whereas in China, the negotiations, it's not as true anymore as it used to be, but the negotiations still begin at the contract, at the signing, not up to the contract signing.
Right. Another important question, Andrew, is obviously one thing is how the North Americans or the Europeans are viewing the Chinese or the Mexican. But a more important question is really how do the Chinese, compared to the Mexicans, view the Americans? Because I guess their view of the North Americans are different.
Okay. In a way, in a very essential way, Chinese and Mexican negotiators have an identical view of the United States. They want the transaction. They want the money. And both sides are willing to do many things to get at the money until it threatens core values. All right, now I'm using the Chinese language. Core values is affecting the Chinese-U.S. relationship right now because China feels its core values are being undermined by U.S. activities. In Mexico, that trade agreement I talked to you about, the U.S. Canada-Mexico agreement, U.S. CMA or TMEC or NAFTA 2, that is the core value. The core value in Mexico is they want Mexicans working.
Right.
They want Mexicans working. They want Mexicans spending. They want Mexicans to climb that economic ladder or at least stay where they are. And that TMEC treaty, NAFTA 2, that's the Mexican core value right now. So Mexico is willing to do a lot to keep that treaty honored, to keep those factories on the border working. However, Mexico and China do share a very difficult history with the West in general and with the United States in particular.
Mm,
So Mexico and China, especially with this president AMLO and Xi
mm,
Jinping in China, there's
mm,
kind of natural overlap in that but their constituencies both want to see them stand up to the West. That
mm,
plays well in China. It plays well in Mexico.
mm,
But on the other hand, right now, the cross border, the U.S. relationship, the headwinds are, the winds are favoring Mexico.
mm,
You know, the Mexico is definitely benefiting from the global anti-U.S. feeling because
mm.
U.S. is doing more in Mexican factories.
Right, right.
The relationship is a headwind against China right now because the
Mm,
Chinese are suffering the brunt of not only the tariffs, but now the trade restrictions, where they can't buy the chips they
mm.
want that are, powering the
Right,
Chinese dream, which we don't talk
right,
about anymore. But there used to
right.
be a dream that was China, or
Mm,
Jinping dream that was China, and U.S. policies are definitely undermining that.
right,
So
right.
on either side, not popular on either side of China, China
Mm,
or Mexico, but it is the end result is these weird political configurations are favoring Mexico and harming business in China, and will
right.
continue to undermine your business in China. And I'm looking at you,
Mm,
procurement people. I don't care about
mm,
politics. I don't care about the relationships. What I care
mm.
about is at the end of the day, can you do business and do you know
Right,
what that business is costing you? And
right,
political risk means that procurement people don't know their real cost because they don't
right,
know
right,
the real risk. If
right.
you don't know if the
Okay.
ball is going to go, okay,
Mm,
that's what it comes down to. Your risk is now outside the factory gate in China. And
mm.
procurement people have not come to terms with that.
Right.
Procurement people don't like that situation because of how messy it is. There's no
Mm,
number next to that anymore. The number
mm.
used to be close to zero. Now,
Right,
for some of you guys, the number is close to infinity.
right,
Sometimes,
right.
not always. When, I don't know, because it's ex
Mm,
factory gate risk.
right, right. Interesting.
Sorry.
And no, that was great. Thank you so much, Andrew. Andrew, another question which is a little more tough, really, is a matter of trust. Now, one of my angles into negotiation is the importance of trust, the creation of trust and maintaining trust in a relationship. Would you explain or define trust differently from China to Mexico, both from the Mexican and the Chinese towards the North American, and from North Americans into China and Mexico? Is there a different level of how trust is perceived?
Okay. In both China and Mexico, they feel that trust is more important to them than it is to the American counterpart.
Right.
Both
Okay.
Mexicans and Chinese have very high levels of power distance.
Right.
I use, if you want to check my source work, I use the Hofstede
Mm,
six dimensions of culture index is a great website for that.
right.
So both Chinese and Mexicans have very high power distance
Mm,
indicators and very low collectivism, very high
right.
collectivism, very
Right.
low individualist. They
Yeah.
are down with the whole power structure. They are
Right.
okay with. Are you still there?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Okay, so both Mexicans and Chinese use very high levels of operate with very high levels of power distance and very low
Mm,
levels of individualism. Very
mm,
collectivist, very into authority. They
right.
are very into the social hierarchy. They believe in trust. They believe in people honoring their word and fitting in
Mm,
to the hierarchy. They
right.
think Americans don't. Americans are too
Mm,
individualist. Americans are too renegade. We're the cowboys. We're the ones who don't
right.
respect trust. That
Right.
being said, you are a Westerner negotiating with Mexico, negotiating with China. What you'll
Mm,
find, especially in China, let's talk about China.
mm,
What I get from a lot of Americans and what I get from a lot of Europeans is they have built up a good trust-based relationship with their direct counterparts in China.
mm,
The factory manager or their counterparts in the subsidiary in China, they have a great relationship. They
mm,
love that guy. That
mm,
guy is their go-to guy. They have
mm,
actually they have too good a relationship in many cases because in many cases their China guy knows more about the production and more about the supply chain than they do.
mm,
The problem is that that guy, the China guy that they have such respect for, he is being influenced by something else. He's
mm,
being influenced by Chinese society, by politics, by government, by those outside levels of the onion that we don't like bothering with in procurement.
mm.
We
Sure.
don't like getting involved with government. We don't like getting involved with
Right.
politics. It's
Right.
messy.
Right. Mm,
This is the problem for the trust-based relationship in America and Europe to that Shenzhen factory guy who you love
right.
and trust, or to your
Right.
department head in Shanghai who you've worked out a good relationship with.
Right.
He's no longer as reliable as you want him to be because the
Mm,
government party is affecting the relationship.
right.
In Mexico, you have just the opposite situation. You have
Okay.
trust with a contract because
Mm,
when you're negotiating with the Caterpillar procurement or the Caterpillar supplier in Saltillo, you're basically negotiating with the Caterpillar guy in Illinois
right.
or in Decatur or in Detroit
Right.
or anywhere
Right.
else. So
Right.
you've got the same thing. Trust is important, but it's the contract, it's the certification, it's the test
Mm,
results that matter
right.
more.
Right.
The Mexican negotiator expects to develop trust, but a lack of
Mm,
trust in Mexico is seen as a negative. This is a
mm,
problem. This gets kicked
mm.
up. This is the factory assistant manager going, the factory manager going, I don't know if I trust this guy. Can you check him out? Can you bring him
Right.
in?
Right.
It's a bit,
Right.
it's baseline.
Right.
Whereas in China, you're linking into this whole guanxi chain where it's a two-way obligation,
Mm,
which
mm.
is now being affected, it's being
Right.
poisoned, if you will, by your contacts, guanxi relationships that you don't see. He's got
Right.
guanxi relationships with the party. He's got guanxi
Right.
relationships with his suppliers, and they're
Sure.
telling him stuff that is going to affect your relationship with him. You don't
Mm,
really get that so much in Mexico.
right. Right. It also sounds, Andrew, a little bit risky. I mean, if I fully understand and appreciate the relationship and the importance of the relationship and trust with the factory manager in China, but what happens if he's not there tomorrow?
This is we're going back to a mutual friend of ours, Dan Harris.
Mm,
Dan Harris has said this from China Law Blog. He likes to
mm,
say that your relationship is not with the company; it's with an individual. And when
right.
that individual moves, Guanxi moves.
Mm,
When that
mm,
individual moves on, your relationship moves on.
right.
Now, I've been doing this since 1996 is when I started bringing people up to China.
Mm,
This is something we've been working on, and a lot of procurement people have, and on both sides, a lot of procurement people and a lot of factory managers and salesmen and suppliers in China have figured this out, and they have
mm,
taken our advice of building multiple contact points within your supply.
mm,
But
mm,
it is risky. Supply
mm,
Maintaining the supply chain in China. A lot of times they look like bow ties where there's only one point of contact. I'm sorry,
right.
yeah, bow ties. What we want is diamonds. We want there to
Right.
be multiple points of contact.
Right.
And if you haven't done that by now, it's all the
Mm,
more of an incentive to kind of
right.
reassess your China operation. If you
Right.
don't
Right.
have multiple points of contact, yeah, your risks
Mm,
are getting much higher.
right. Now,
And
Andrew, we've been spending most of the time talking about the US and Mexico relationship and US and China, but we do have a huge audience in Western Europe as well. And Western Europe are basically sitting in the same situation than the US. They are very much depending on China. And what we can learn in Europe right now, which is interesting, obviously, is their dependence on energy from Russia, where several countries in Europe, especially Germany, for instance, as we all know, has been hugely dependent on gas from Russia. And I think it was a general from Pentagon here in the US who recently said that what the Germans never figured out is that energy policy is security policy. And
yeah,
now
yeah.
we can talk about supply chain policy, security policy as well. So back to Europe. Obviously, Mexico is equally far away from Europe as China. So you being a procurement officer in a Western European company, what should you do now? Because Mexico may not be the alternative right now.
Well, what a lot of us are learning to do is to segregate and decompose our supply chains for different markets. So if you're interested, if a European firm is marketing to the United States, which a lot are, that's something to look at first.
Sure.
Can you segregate and decompose your supply chain to take advantage of spheres?
Right.
Spheres of influence is a phrase I've brought back from the dead in my writing, and I think most procurement people are going to have to get used to the idea that you have tax advantages and you have tariff advantages, and FTA situations are going to be messier, and it's everyone's still relying on WTO, or a lot of people, especially in Europe or in the UK, are kicking off their WTO notes, because that's what we're going back to.
Right.
For the UK anyway. A lot of us are going to be looking also to source things in Latin America that you previously sourced in China. So even if you are solely a European company with a European supply chain, if you want lithium or batteries for EVs or batteries for mobile devices, your choices are probably going to be the North American supply chain or the Chinese supply chain. I don't think you're getting a lot of rare earths in Europe. The security thing, the shortage thing, the logistic things, all of these new factors in our life are just making procurement more difficult. We like large scale procurement. We like one deal that's going to be a global deal.
Right.
Might be more complicated going forward. That might not always be possible, and it might not always make sense. We're going to be seeing a lot more, trade deals that look like pieces of a puzzle, where you're based on where you have free trade agreements. CPTPP, I was getting it wrong. It's TPP. The CPTPP and RCEP and and TMAC and all the different European agreements. Unfortunately, they are going to determine a lot of our lives. The FTA situation in Mexico is very favorable. The FTA situation in in the United States is not that favorable. So people are going to be making decisions based on that. If you're British, you've got a lot of research to do on FTAs because you're not in a lot of them now. Finding this out, I know this is breaking news, but we still don't know where the pieces are going to fall for the British-U.S. trade relationship. Europe is something similar. We don't know what BRI is going to do now. Kazakhstan might be off limits because they're going to get involved in the war. It's very complicated, Keld. It's getting more complicated. I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to tell Eurocentric, specific to Europe. To procurement people, what the best move is going to be. But what I'm telling you is your relationship with China is deteriorating quickly. And you're going to have to look for sourcing on sensitive material and sensitive parts.
What I'm reading, what I'm hearing as well, Andrew, is that certain people and groups are trying to promote Africa, as Africa being a potential production area and a potential market, and it's growing, and we have to focus on that. Do you see Africa on the radar in the future as a place as well?
Africa is definitely on the radar. Since leaving China, I've learned to disaggregate the potential for markets and potential for supply chain and materials. So Africa as a market, hugely interesting. As a supply chain, I think it's going to take a role for Europe similar to the role that Mexico has for the United States, in that it is close. It can be made relatively cheap, and just the proximity removes risk that we have not seen before. We've never seen the Pacific Ocean as particularly risky waters before, but now we are. So having Africa, the proximity to Europe is, I think, going to be of interest to supply chain people.
Right. Right. Okay.
For us over in the United States, Africa is more interesting as a market right now.
Okay. Andrew, last question before we have to wrap up. We are talking here September 2022, and hopefully it's not going to happen. But if tension increases and something should happen between China and Taiwan, and obviously I just heard Biden the other day say that the US would guarantee the safety of Taiwan and the US would defend Taiwan. Obviously, none of us have a crystal ball, can predict what would happen, but how would that mess up everything if China decided that they wanted to take Taiwan?
Okay. First of all, I don't think I'm one of the people who thinks it's not going to happen in the near future. But I also think that if it does happen, it's going to be more along the lines of two boats accidentally bumping into each other and things escalating out of hand. So I don't think it's going to be planned in the near future, but it's a very real concern. Here are the limits, or here are the steps of the concern. Step one would be limited military conflict that would shut down shipping from China, probably Taiwan, but leave much of the rest of the region unscathed. So right now, Vietnam has a choice. They have the northern route when they're sending boats to the west. They usually send boats to China, but I'm assuming that supply chain people could reroute boats to the southern route and avoid the Taiwan region and military hardware. That's the optimistic. So it'd be awful, but boats from Taiwan and boats from Thailand and Vietnam could continue to go to the United States. I'm skeptical about that. That would be pretty easy for China to shut down. And I think that if we have a full-blown war, you're going to see the Pacific Ocean largely off limits. You're going to see the overland routes from China to Europe, which aren't that significant now, but those are going to be diverted to the war efforts. In what you're describing, Keld, could very well escalate to a world war. So you could see China and Russia supporting each other's wartime manufacturing efforts, diverting everything from consumer goods and B2B goods, industrial goods. So it's going to be awful. How awful? Ranging from complete shutdown of trade involving Asia to mitigated shutdown of trade to Asia. It's a worse scenario.
Right. But again, as you said, Andrew, it wouldn't really, from a market or economical situation, it wouldn't make sense for anybody, especially not China either, would it? I mean, especially as you said, if the risk is everything is being shut down.
I understand that. I agree with you, Keld, but I'm hearing that too much. This is what everyone who wants trade to continue is saying. And I want trade to continue. So I'm saying it too. That's the first thing I said to you was, I don't think it's going to happen. But we set the stage for an uncontrolled escalation. Right.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is obviously what we have seen in Europe is food export from Ukraine has been halted to a certain degree, delayed, and even stopped because of that conflict. So I'm just comparing that to what could happen in Asia, right?
If the way the ports are set, based on the geography of Taiwan and of China, if there is active conflict between Taiwan and China, a lot of coastal China gets involved. A lot of ports get shut down. I can't see doing a lot of business from Ningbo if there's active missile fire. And Shenzhen, Hong Kong, I don't know. I'm skeptical there will be conflict, but once conflict begins, I'm also skeptical the economic impact can be contained in the short term.
Right. So anyway, to try and end on a positive note, Andrew, what's the good news? What's the good stuff in the world of supply chain?
Okay, the good news in the world of supply chain is there's a lot of planned disruption going on, and that creates opportunities. So people who were late to the China game or didn't really maximize the benefits of globalization during the China days, you have a second shot. Mexico is gearing up for that North American business. Latin America looks a lot like emerging markets of the 90s and the early 2000s. This is where the opportunity is. So yes, I realize that it's very disrupting, and it's going to be very difficult for a lot of procurement people to make the adjustment. But unless you were the absolute, if you weren't the absolute market leader before, here's your shot to disrupt. And if you were the market leader before, here's your chance to extend. So I'm looking at Latin America, Mexico and Latin America as a new source of production, a new source of material, and eventually potentially a new source of markets.
Right.
I think other negotiators, especially those involved in cross-cultural negotiation, should view this as a great opportunity. Possibly, Latin America and Africa make up our last market opportunity.
Okay. And if we should wrap up with one last piece of advice that you could give our audience, what would that be in general, Andrew?
The time is now, and if you don't start negotiating for a position in Mexico, you should at least be developing an information plan. You should at least be doing a business environment analysis and feasibility studies to see if this is an option for you. It's not going to be an option for every company, but now is definitely the time to start. And the way you start is by developing an information plan. So if you haven't done it already, get on that now.
And Andrew, if people want to utilize your expertise and pick your brain and get in contact with you, how can they follow you and get in contact with you?
The best way to get in touch with me, the only social media I use is LinkedIn. Look for me at LinkedIn. And notice we have two different spellings. My name is Andrew. Last name is H-U-P, like Peter, E-R-T. I will be announcing my new company soon, but for right now, the best way to get in touch with me is andrew.hubert@gmail.com. I'll be announcing a new company shortly.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your time. It was really good. I know that our audience here will appreciate everything that we talked about today. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Keld. It was great talking to you, great catching up, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.